Most ships, when they get hit bad enough, they sink. That's just how it works. The ocean wins. It always wins. But every once in a while, a ship comes along that just refuses to follow the rules. A ship that takes damage that should have killed her 10 times over and somehow, impossibly, keeps going. The USS Samuel B. Roberts is one of those ships. And what happened to her on October 25, 1944, in a patch of water off the Philippines called Leyte Gulf, is one of the most unbelievable stories in naval history. A tiny ship, a ship so small the Navy barely considered her a real warship, went up against the most powerful naval fleet Japan had ever assembled. And she didn't run, she didn't hide, she attacked. By the time it was over, she was sitting on the ocean floor. But the men who served on her, they made sure the enemy knew they'd been in a fight. This is that story. To understand why what happened at Leyte Gulf was so insane, you need to understand what the Samuel B. Roberts actually was. She wasn't a battleship. She wasn't a cruiser. She wasn't even a destroyer, which is already a pretty small class of warship. She was what they called a destroyer escort. Her job was basically to protect convoys from submarines. She was built to chase underwater threats, not to fight surface battles against massive warships. She was 306 feet long. For context, a Japanese battleship like the Yamato, which would show up at Leyte Gulf, was over 800 feet long. The Yamato's guns fired shells that weighed as much as a small car. The Samuel B. Roberts had guns that could barely scratch a ship like that. Her crew knew this. They weren't stupid. They knew exactly what kind of ship they were on and what she was built for. But they also knew something else. They were sailors in the United States Navy, and they had a job to do. The commander of the Samuel B. Roberts was Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland. He was 34 years old. He'd been in the Navy long enough to know what was about to happen when his radar started picking up contacts on the morning of October 25th. A lot of contacts. Big ones. What was coming toward them wasn't a small patrol force. It wasn't a handful of destroyers. It was Center Force, the most powerful surface fleet Japan had sent into battle in years. Battleships, heavy cruisers, destroyers. All of them bearing down on a group of small American ships called Taffy 3. Taffy 3 was not built for this kind of fight. It was a group of escort carriers, small, slow aircraft carriers that carried planes for supporting ground troops, along with a handful of destroyers and destroyer escorts, including the Samuel B. Roberts. They were not combat ships in the traditional sense. They were support ships. They were supposed to be far from the main battle, doing logistical work while the big guns fought it out somewhere else. The main American fleet, the one with the actual battleships, wasn't there. They'd been pulled away the night before, chasing a Japanese decoy force north. It was a trap, and it worked. Admiral Halsey, the commander of the main fleet, took the bait completely. He moved his battleships and carriers north to chase what he thought was the real threat, leaving the waters around Leyte Gulf wide open. Nobody was supposed to come through from the west. That's what everyone thought. That's what made what happened next so catastrophic. Taffy 3 was completely exposed, in the wrong place, with the wrong ships, facing something they were never built to deal with. So when those radar contacts started showing up, and when lookouts started seeing the massive pagoda-style masts of Japanese battleships rising over the horizon, the men of Taffy 3 realized something terrifying. They were alone, and the Japanese had found them. At around 6:58 in the morning, the Japanese opened fire. Those first salvos were something the men of Taffy 3 had never seen before. The Japanese used different colored dyes in their shells so they could tell which ship was hitting what, and the water around the American ships started exploding in columns of green, red, and yellow spray. It looked almost beautiful if you didn't think too hard about what it was. The American carriers started running. They turned south, pushed their engines as hard as they could, and called for help. The pilots launched every aircraft they had, even planes that weren't loaded with weapons, just to harass the Japanese ships and distract their gunners. Some of those pilots made attack runs with literally nothing on their planes. No bombs, no torpedoes, no rockets. They just flew straight at Japanese warships and hoped it would make the gunners flinch. That's how desperate the situation was. Everyone was doing whatever they could think of, because the alternative was doing nothing and watching the carriers get blown apart one by one. But running wasn't going to be enough. The Japanese were faster, their ships were closing in, and their guns were finding the range. If something didn't slow them down, the carriers were going to be caught and destroyed. That's when Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague gave the order. He told his destroyers and destroyer escorts to attack. Think about what that order meant. He was telling small ships, ships with almost no armor, ships that carried torpedoes designed for anti-submarine work, to go and attack a fleet of Japanese battleships and cruisers. He was telling them to sail directly into the guns of ships that outweighed them by tens of thousands of tons. He was telling them to go die so the carriers could live. And everyone on those ships understood that. There was no confusion about what the order meant. They knew. It was an order that almost certainly meant death. The destroyer Johnston went first. She was one of the bigger ships in the group, a full destroyer, not just an escort, and her commander Ernest Evans turned her directly toward the Japanese fleet and started running at full speed. He didn't wait for a specific order, he just went. Evans was known for being aggressive. He had actually told his crew when he took command of the Johnston that he was going to fight, that if they ever faced a hopeless situation, he wouldn't back down. And he kept that promise. He turned that ship around and charged at a fleet that could have swatted him out of the water without breaking a sweat. The Samuel B. Roberts wasn't far behind. Commander Copeland got on the intercom and spoke to his crew. He told them what they were facing. He didn't sugarcoat it. He said something along the lines of, "This is going to be a fight against overwhelming odds, and the outcome is almost certainly death, but we're going to do our duty." He told them he was proud of them. He told them what was at stake, and then he pointed the ship at the enemy and pushed the engines forward. The crew of the Samuel B. Roberts went to battle stations. What followed was one of the most intense surface engagements of the entire Pacific War, and the Samuel B. Roberts was right in the middle of it. She launched her torpedoes first. She fired all 3 of her torpedo tubes at the Japanese cruisers and then kept going, pushing herself right into the middle of the Japanese formation, using her guns to fire at ships she had absolutely no business fighting. Her guns were 5-inch guns. Against the armor of a heavy cruiser, a 5-inch shell isn't going to do much. It's not going to punch through that plating and blow up something vital, but it's going to sting. It's going to cause damage to the upper parts of the ship, knock out equipment, hurt people, and most importantly, it's going to make the Japanese gunners pay attention to you instead of the carriers. That was the whole point. Get the Japanese to look at you. Make yourself the problem they need to solve. Buy time. Every minute those carriers were still running was a minute they might actually survive. That's what the Samuel B. Roberts was doing. She was making herself a target so the carriers could run. For a while, it worked. The Samuel B. Roberts moved through rain squalls and smoke screens, firing constantly, dodging salvos, maneuvering hard. Her crew was working their guns so fast that the barrels were overheating. They were throwing shells at a rate the ship wasn't really designed to maintain. The men below deck were sweating through their uniforms, passing shells up as fast as they could, knowing that every second they kept those guns firing was another second the carriers had to get away. It was brutal, exhausting work done by men who knew they might not see the next hour. And then the Japanese found her. At around 8:51 in the morning, the Samuel B. Roberts took her first major hits. A Japanese cruiser found the range and put shells into her, then more shells, then more. One of the hits knocked out her forward fire room, which killed her speed immediately. A ship that can't move fast in a naval battle is a ship that's going to get hit again and again, and that's exactly what happened. More shells came in. They punched through her thin hull. They started fires. They killed men in the engine rooms, in the gun mounts, everywhere. And then the worst hit came. A Japanese shell, some accounts say it was from a heavy cruiser, hit the Samuel B. Roberts in a way that caused a catastrophic explosion. It blew a hole in her hull that was roughly 40 feet wide, 40 feet, on a ship that was only 306 feet long. That's not a hole, that's the ship being torn open. Water came pouring in faster than anything could stop it. The men near that section of the ship who survived said it felt like the ocean just reached in and grabbed her. The ship immediately started taking on water at a rate that no pump could keep up with. She was dying. But here's the thing about the crew of the Samuel B. Roberts. Even after that hit, even after it became obvious the ship was going down, the men at the guns kept firing. The crew members who weren't dealing with damage control or casualties kept loading shells and pulling triggers. They fired until the guns wouldn't fire anymore. They fired until the ship was so low in the water that the gun mounts couldn't be used. One gun crew facing a Japanese cruiser that was right on top of them kept firing manually after the power went out. Without the electrical systems, they had to hand-load each shell and fire it by percussion. They did this over and over again, hitting the cruiser multiple times at point-blank range before a Japanese shell finally silenced them. Those men knew the ship was sinking under their feet. They knew there was almost no chance they were walking away from this. And they kept loading. They kept firing. Because that's what they came out there to do. At 9:35 in the morning, Commander Copeland gave the order to abandon ship. The crew went into the water. The Samuel B. Roberts rolled to her side, and at 10:05 she sank. She had fought for just over an hour. In that time, she had fired over 600 rounds of ammunition. She had fired her torpedoes. She had put herself between an overwhelming Japanese force and the carriers she was protecting. She had taken punishment that should have ended her in minutes and kept fighting until the very last possible moment. The men in the water weren't safe yet. They would spend the next 2 days floating in shark-infested waters, waiting for rescue, losing men the whole time. Of her 224-man crew, 89 did not survive. Some died in the battle, others died in the water waiting to be found. 2 days in the open ocean. No food, no fresh water, surrounded by sharks, not knowing if anyone was even coming for them. The men who made it through said those hours in the water were in some ways worse than the battle itself. At least in the battle they had something to do. In the water, all they could do was wait and hope. Commander Copeland survived. He stayed in the water with his men, helping keep them together and afloat until they were finally rescued. What the Samuel B. Roberts and the rest of Taffy 3 accomplished that morning is almost hard to believe when you look at the numbers. A handful of escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts, with their aggressive defense, their torpedo attacks, and their refusal to just run, convinced Admiral Kurita, the commander of the Japanese center force, to break off the attack. The Japanese had the Americans beaten. They were faster, they had more firepower, and they had more ships. If they had pushed through, they could have reached the invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf and caused catastrophic damage to the American operation in the Philippines. The whole campaign could have been set back months. Thousands more lives would have been lost. The timeline of the entire war in the Pacific could have changed. That's not an exaggeration. That's what was actually on the line that morning. But they didn't. They turned around. There are different theories about why. Some historians say Kurita was confused about what he was actually facing. The aggressive American attacks made him think he was dealing with a much larger force than he was. Some say he was worried about losing too many ships. Some say he was exhausted. His fleet had already been through days of fighting and attacks just to get to Leyte Gulf, and his judgment wasn't as sharp as it should have been. Whatever the reason, he gave the order to withdraw, and just like that, the danger passed. Taffy 3 had won. These tiny ships, these support vessels, had fought off the most powerful Japanese surface force of the war, the Samuel B. Roberts earned the nickname the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship. It's a name that stuck because there's really no better way to describe what she did. She punched so far above her weight class that it's hard to even put it into words. Her commander, Robert Copeland, was awarded the Navy Cross. Many of her crew received medals for what they did that day. The ship herself was given a Presidential Unit Citation, one of the highest honors a ship and crew can receive. Years later, when people would ask the survivors what it was like, what it felt like to be on a ship that small going up against ships that big, the answer was usually some version of the same thing. They didn't really think about it. They just did what they had to do. Their shipmates were counting on them. The carriers were counting on them. So they fought. That's the thing about the Samuel B. Roberts. She didn't refuse to sink because of any technical reason. She didn't refuse to sink because of some special armor or extraordinary engineering. She refused to sink because the men aboard her refused to stop fighting. They kept that ship alive and kept those guns firing through sheer will. The ocean eventually took her. It always does. But before she went down, she made sure that the people who needed protecting had time to get away. She traded herself for the lives of the men on those carriers, and she went down swinging. The wreck of the Samuel B. Roberts was actually discovered in 2022, sitting on the ocean floor at a depth of about 22,000 feet in the Philippine Sea, making her one of the deepest shipwrecks ever found. When the team found her and sent down cameras to look at the wreck, they could still see the battle damage, the holes where the shells came through, the twisted metal where the explosions tore her apart. She's been down there for over 80 years, and she still looks like she went out fighting. There's something about a story like this that's hard to shake. It's not just a war story. It's a story about what people do when they're completely outmatched, and they know it, and they choose to fight anyway. Not because they think they're going to win, but because the alternative is letting something worse happen to people who can't protect themselves. That's the kind of thing that's easy to say, and incredibly hard to actually do when you're standing in front of it. These men actually did it. They looked at something impossible and they didn't flinch. The Samuel B. Roberts did that. Her crew did that. And even though the ship is gone, the story isn't. If you want to see more stories like this, subscribe, there's a lot more where this came from.